They sprayed my face with water, saying, "Dogs eat cleaner." The water was cold, sharp, not enough to sting, but enough to shame, and the shame was worse than any pain. I felt the drops roll down my chin, dampening the collar of my blouse, and in that moment I thought of all the years I had stood in kitchens, wiping the chins of children who spilled their soup, laughing softly so they would not feel small, so they would not remember themselves as messy or clumsy, and I wondered how it was possible that the same child, my own flesh, had now joined a man in treating me as though I were beneath even that mercy. They thought it was a joke, a correction, like scolding a pet. But I heard in those words the real truth they carried inside them, the truth they had never said aloud, the truth that I was an inconvenience, an embarrassment, something tolerated only because of blood and history. When the water touched me, I remembered who I was not. I was not their servant. I was not their burden. I was not the shadow of their perfect life. And yet in that house I had been pressed into those shapes until I almost believed it myself. I am 81 now. I live alone in a modest senior flat, 2 rooms and a window that lets in good morning light, and though it is simple, it is mine in a way that house never was, and I guard its door like a treasure, because behind it no one can laugh at me for existing. I sit each day at a wooden table where the varnish has faded, where the scratches tell stories of other tenants, other lives, and I drink tea out of a glass cup, not plastic, not a child's bowl, and I raise it slowly to my lips as if that gesture itself were proof that I am still human, still deserving of dignity. I suppose that is why I begin here, with this memory that still burns like vinegar on a cut, because the wound they left me with did not come from the water, but from the revelation that the people I once trusted to keep me safe were the same ones who wanted to unmake me, to shrink me into something less than I am. Before all of this, before the spraying, before the cruelty became so obvious that I could not deny it anymore, I had told myself the usual lies mothers tell when they are pushed aside. I told myself that my daughter was simply tired, that her husband was under stress, that their laughter was nervousness and not contempt, that their sharp instructions, sit here, eat that, don't touch, wait, were just the habits of a busy household. I excused every wound as though I were a doctor treating a patient I loved, patching up their behavior with explanations and excuses. I reminded myself of the stories of hardship I had endured, how I raised my child alone after my husband died, how I worked extra shifts to keep her in school, how I sacrificed vacations, new clothes, and quiet evenings for the sake of her future. I told myself that surely, love had not disappeared, that surely she remembered. And yet, when the water struck my face, the last veil was torn away. That was not fatigue. That was not stress. That was contempt made flesh. I live alone now, and that is a sentence I once feared, but now repeat with something like pride. Alone does not mean abandoned, though I was both. Alone does not mean unloved, though I was treated as such. Alone means free of the endless performance of gratitude that was demanded of me, free of the constant surveillance of eyes that weighed my every step, free of the dismissive hand on my arm that pushed me back into silence whenever I tried to speak. Alone means I can sit in the morning and read the newspaper slowly, not having to justify my time or defend my memory. Alone means the key in my pocket is my own. It is strange how humiliation lingers not in the act itself, but in the silence that follows. After the water sprayed across my cheek, I looked at my daughter, expecting, even then, some flicker of defense, some spark of shame. But all I saw was her thin, tired smile, the one she wore when she wanted to smooth over conflict without actually facing it. She handed me a napkin as if she were rescuing me, but her eyes were not on me. They were on him, seeking his approval. In that gesture, I saw my place, not as mother, not even as guest, but as a fragile nuisance, tolerated so long as I stayed quiet and small. I think I knew in that instant that I had already lost her, that she had chosen comfort over truth, and that her comfort required my erasure. When I tell people now, if I ever dare to speak of it, they often ask why I stayed as long as I did, why I did not leave sooner, why I endured so many small cuts before I recognized the blade. I do not blame them for asking. They have not lived the slow erosion of dignity that comes not from strangers, but from those who call you family. It is not easy to abandon the people you raised, the people into whom you poured every good part of yourself, even when they turn cold. You keep believing that the next day will be better, that they will remember, that they will see you again not as a burden, but as a person. And so you endure, and each day you grow a little smaller, until you almost forget that you were once large enough to walk into a classroom and command the attention of 30 children, large enough to carry groceries home with one arm while holding your daughter's hand with the other, large enough to make decisions, to sign papers, to shape a household. You forget until something happens that strips away even the illusion, something so blatant that you can no longer excuse it. And for me, it was that water, that casual cruelty disguised as a joke. I live in a senior flat now, and I keep certain habits that remind me I am still myself. I polish my shoes, even if no one sees them. I fold my clothes carefully, not because I expect visitors, but because I want to honor the woman who still wears them. I cook small meals for myself, not only what is necessary, but what is pleasurable, adding cinnamon to my porridge or slicing fruit into careful segments, as if I were preparing for company. These little rituals are my rebellion against the voice in my head that sometimes whispers the words they threw at me, the voice that tells me I am messy, clumsy, unworthy. Each ritual is a reminder. I am not their dog. I am not their shadow. I am not their shame. I am a woman who survived, and survival itself is a kind of triumph. I begin with the water because it was both the smallest act and the largest revelation. It was a spray from a bottle, a few drops, and yet it was the weight of decades crashing down on me. It forced me to see clearly that I was no longer safe in the house I had once called home, that I had been transformed in their eyes into something less than human. It was the moment I understood that if I wanted to live the rest of my life as a person and not as a problem, I would have to walk away, even if it meant walking into emptiness. And so, when I lift my glass now in this quiet flat, when I let the morning light turn the water inside it into a prism of shifting color, I think not of the bottle that once humiliated me, but of the hand that still rises, steady, dignified, unbroken. The night of the spraying did not end with shouting. It ended with something far worse. The silence of ordinary life resuming as though nothing had happened, as though I had not been degraded at that table, as though my damp blouse and reddened cheeks were invisible, and I remember sitting there with my spoon half raised while they continued their conversation about work schedules and mortgage refinancing, and I realized, with an almost physical jolt, that they did not see me anymore, not as a mother, not as a guest, not even as an old woman to be cared for out of pity. They saw only an obstacle, a mouth that sometimes shook, hands that sometimes spilled, a presence that complicated the tidy picture they wanted to present to their neighbors and friends. And that realization was like stepping into an empty room where you once believed people waited for you with love. Later, after the dishes were cleared, after the children were sent upstairs, I excused myself quietly and went to the small room they had given me, a converted storage space with thin curtains that let in the street lamp's harsh glow. And I sat on the narrow bed without removing my shoes because I did not want to give them the satisfaction of thinking I was comfortable. I stared at the carpet, beige and worn, and heard their laughter downstairs, not cruel now, not sharp, but ordinary domestic laughter. And it struck me with a kind of madness that this, too, was part of the cruelty, that they could humiliate me with one breath and forget me with the next. And that forgetting was a worse violence because it meant they would never acknowledge what they had done. I sat on that bed for hours, not crying, not praying, simply sitting. And in that sitting, I began to feel the stirrings of a decision, though I could not yet name it. The air was stuffy, the radiator ticking, and I thought of all the rooms I had occupied in my life. The classrooms filled with chalk dust and young faces, the apartments I cleaned after long shifts at the hospital, the bedroom I once shared with my husband before illness hollowed him out, and I realized that this room, this narrow, borrowed space, was the first room where I felt like an intruder in my own bloodline. I reached into my purse and pulled out the old envelope where I kept my identification, my savings card, a faded photograph of my daughter as a girl with ribbons in her hair, and I held it in my lap as if to remind myself that I was not only what they saw now. I was a woman with a past, with documents, with proof, and that proof could still be used. The next morning, when my daughter tapped lightly at the door and asked if I wanted tea, I looked at her and almost believed she might apologize, almost believed there was still a bridge to walk across. But when she spoke, her eyes were fixed, somewhere over my shoulder, and her voice was rehearsed, polite, strained with the effort of pretending last night had been nothing. She set the mug down without waiting for me to answer, and said in a voice that was both gentle and firm, "You have to understand, Mom. It's hard for Greg sometimes. He doesn't mean it. He just gets frustrated." And in that sentence, I heard the full betrayal, because she had chosen to protect him rather than me. She had chosen his ease over my dignity, and she expected me to nod, to accept, to swallow both the water and the words as though I were indeed less than human. I sipped the tea slowly, not for warmth, but to give myself time to steady the tremor in my hand, and I said only, "I understand," though what I understood was far greater than she realized. That day unfolded with a strange clarity, as if my eyes had been washed by the very water meant to degrade me. I watched how they moved around the house, how my daughter hovered near Greg, how she preemptively smoothed over his irritation, how she shifted me into corners, out of sight when neighbors visited, how my presence was always managed rather than welcomed. I noticed the locked drawer in the kitchen where my medications were kept, the way Greg glanced at the calendar where doctor's appointments were penciled in, the conversations they had in low voices about next steps. And I knew then that the path before me was narrowing, that soon they would make decisions not only about my room and my meals, but about my very personhood, that the small humiliations would solidify into legal declarations, and that I would be erased not only in laughter, but on paper. The catalyst came in the most ordinary way, a trip to the pharmacy. They asked me to come along, partly because they did not trust me to stay in the house alone for long hours, partly because they wanted me to carry the small bags they would collect along the way. At the counter, when the pharmacist asked for verification of my birth date, I answered clearly, firmly, my voice echoing just slightly in the sterile space. And the woman behind the desk looked at me, not at Greg, not at my daughter, but at me. And she smiled the way you smile at someone who is still there, present, whole. It was such a small exchange, so brief, but it was enough to remind me that outside their house, I still existed in the eyes of strangers, that in the world beyond their walls, I was still a person with agency. I signed for my prescription with a steady hand, and I saw Greg watching, his jaw tight, his annoyance barely concealed, and in that look I recognized fear, not of my frailty, but of my strength, of the fact that I still had a signature, still had a voice, still had documents that tied me to more than their household. That night, lying in the narrow bed again, I made the quiet decision that would change everything. I would not allow them to write the ending of my story. I did not yet know how I would leave, or where I would go, or who would help me, but I knew with a certainty, deeper than any fear, that I could not remain in a place where water was used as a weapon, where my daughter's love had become a shield for her husband's cruelty, where my life was reduced to an inconvenience. I thought of the photograph of her as a child, the one I kept folded in my wallet, her smile open and unguarded, and I mourned her as though she were already gone, because the woman downstairs was no longer that girl, and I could no longer wait for her to return. The true betrayal was not the water, not even the laughter. It was the knowledge that she saw and chose silence, that she measured my humiliation against her own comfort and found me expendable. That realization hardened in me like stone, and I carried it carefully, silently, waiting for the moment when I could act. I began hiding the sedatives they slipped into my tea, tucking them under my tongue and later spitting them into tissues, flushing them when no one was watching. I began listening more closely when they spoke of finances, of documents, of arrangements, and I understood that they believed I would remain compliant until the end, that they had underestimated the woman who once held down 2 jobs and raised a child alone, the woman who taught herself to navigate bureaucracies and banks and hospitals, the woman who had buried grief and kept walking. They had forgotten, but I had not. The betrayal at that table was the spark, but the fire was already waiting in the dry wood of years of small erasures, and once lit, it could not be extinguished. I did not cry. I did not shout. I did not beg. I simply waited, gathering the fragments of myself they had tried to scatter. And I promised myself that the next time I raised a glass, it would not be in their house, not in their presence, but in a place where I was once again a woman, whole and unashamed. After the night of the pharmacy, after I realized that the world still saw me as someone who could speak and sign her own name, the house began to feel even more suffocating, as if the walls themselves resented my stubbornness, and every detail I had, once ignored, became sharper, crueler, impossible to excuse. The quiet worsening began, not with shouting or sudden blows, but with the kind of steady erosion that wears down stone over years. A drip of contempt here, a scrape of dismissal there. until you begin to doubt whether you ever were whole. It was in the way they rearranged the cupboards so the foods I liked were always pushed to the back, in the way they shortened the laces on my shoes so I would struggle longer to tie them, in the way my magazines and books slowly disappeared from my room until all that was left was a stack of old bills they claimed they needed me to sign. These were not accidents. These were not coincidences. They were rehearsals for my erasure. Little rehearsals staged daily until they hoped I would forget the performance of my own life. I began to notice the calendar more closely, how appointments were made without my consent, how I was informed of doctor's visits as though they were errands for a child, how Greg spoke on the phone in clipped tones to insurance agents and social workers, never once inviting me into the conversation, though it was my name, my health, my life being discussed. One evening, I overheard him saying to someone, "She's not really aware of what's going on anymore. We just need to streamline her care." And I stood frozen in the hallway, listening to my daughter hum in agreement in the kitchen. And in that moment, the house was no longer a shelter. It was a cage being slowly welded around me. They wanted me smaller, quieter, less visible, until one day I would simply vanish into the paperwork, into the legal language that strips a person of their rights with the stroke of a pen. The food was one of the first battlegrounds. I had always been a woman who loved cooking, who believed meals were not only for the body, but for the spirit. But here, in their home, I was fed like a dependent. My daughter would bring me plates of bland, colorless meals, always on a plastic tray, never in real dishes, as though porcelain might shatter in my hands. When I asked once if I could make soup, a simple thing, my grandmother's recipe, my daughter smiled too brightly and said, "Let's not tire you, Mom. Just rest. You've done enough." And then the pot disappeared from the kitchen the next day. Rest, they called it. But it was not rest. It was dismissal. The stripping away of the small joys that once reminded me who I was. The quiet escalation also lived in the way they spoke about me, never to me. I would hear them in the evenings when they thought I was asleep, their voices drifting through the thin walls. Greg complaining that I moved too slowly, that I cost too much. My daughter agreeing that she could hardly manage, that she felt guilty for thinking of homes, but maybe it was the only option. They never said it in front of me, never risked my reply, but their whispers painted the truth on every surface of that house. I was a burden, and burdens are not loved. They are managed until they can be discarded. Sometimes, in those hours of listening, I wanted to shout, to remind them that the house they lived in was partly built from my savings, that the very car Greg drove had been bought with money I loaned them after his last job loss, that my daughter's education, the one that gave her this life, had been financed by my double shifts and sleepless nights. But I stayed silent, not because I accepted their version of me, but because I knew my silence gave me time to plan. The objects of my life began to vanish one by one. A scarf my late husband gave me, folded neatly on the chair one evening, was gone the next morning. When I asked, my daughter shrugged and said perhaps I had misplaced it. A notebook where I had begun to write small reflections, the beginnings of a journal, disappeared from my drawer. Greg laughed when I asked and said, "You're probably imagining it. You misplace things all the time." I wanted to shout that I did not misplace things, that I had kept track of details and lists and memories for decades when no one else could, that I had managed a household single-handedly, that I had signed every form and remembered every due date. But I only nodded, storing the insult alongside the others, building a kind of private archive of their betrayals. One Sunday morning, I woke to find that the door to my room was slightly ajar. I never left it that way. My belongings had been moved subtly, just enough for me to know someone had been inside, and on the desk lay a pamphlet about assisted living homes, placed as if by accident. The cover showed smiling elderly people in pastel clothing, playing cards in bright sunlit rooms, and I felt a sickness rise in me. Not because of the idea of living among strangers, but because they had placed it there like a prophecy, like a plan. Already made. They wanted me to find it. They wanted me to understand that the countdown had begun. The worst cruelty was not in the pamphlets or the missing objects. It was in the baby monitor. They placed it in my room, small, white, with a glowing green light, and told me it was for safety, that they wanted to hear if I needed help. But the truth was obvious. It was surveillance, the kind used for infants who cannot be trusted to care for themselves. The first night I stared at it glowing in the dark, knowing that any sound I made, any private murmur to myself, any sigh of frustration, would be transmitted into their bedroom where they could laugh or judge in silence. I began to speak less, even to myself, and that silence gnawed at me because I have always been a woman of words, a teacher, a storyteller, someone who narrated life even when no one listened, and now I was gagged by a green light. I fought back in small ways, not openly, never openly, because I knew their power lay in the idea that I was compliant. I began hiding coins in the lining of my purse, slipping small bills into the pages of books when I could get hold of them, creating a secret fund, though it amounted to little. I wrote notes on scraps of paper and hid them in the hem of my pillowcase, reminders of who I had been. You taught, you worked, you raised, you survived. These scraps were my resistance, proof against the narrative they whispered about me. I stopped drinking the tea they brought each night, pretending to sip while pouring it into the plant in the corner. And I watched as the leaves turned yellow, poisoned by whatever they had tried to feed me. I knew then, without doubt, that the quiet cruelty had crossed into danger, that they were preparing me for helplessness. And yet, through all of it, I maintained the mask of gratitude, thanking them for meals, smiling faintly when they patted my arm, nodding when they explained things I already knew. The mask was my shield. I wore it not because I believed them, but because I needed time. Every day I endured was another day closer to action, another day to gather the strength and clarity I would need to walk out of that cage. The first escalation was not a blow or a scream. It was the steady tightening of the noose, the subtle theft of my selfhood. And though it may sound small to those who have not lived it, to be erased piece by piece, meal by meal, whisper by whisper, is a violence more insidious than any wound. It was in those quiet days, those endless hours of managed silence, that I began to shift from despair to determination. They thought they were shrinking me, but in truth they were sharpening me, honing me back into the woman I had always been, the woman who could endure, and then one day rise. The shift did not arrive as thunder, not as confrontation or rebellion, but as a quiet morning when I sat at the kitchen table after they had left for errands, the house humming with the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock. And in front of me was a bowl of cereal soggy from waiting too long in milk, served in a cheap plastic dish with a child's spoon, and I stared at it for a long time, not touching it, realizing that I had accepted this, that I had allowed myself to be reduced to the level of a toddler who could not be trusted with real utensils, and the absurdity of it struck me so sharply that I laughed, a dry laugh that startled even me. because what they had intended as kindness, as precaution, was in fact the clearest declaration that they no longer saw me as capable of the smallest acts of human dignity. That laugh was the first sound of rebellion, not loud, not noticeable to anyone else. But in me, it felt like a door creaking open after years of being locked. I pushed the plastic bowl aside and went to my room, where I still kept a small stack of papers hidden under the mattress, notes I had written to myself in secret, words like teacher, mother, reader, survivor, and I spread them on the bed like puzzle pieces of a life I was determined to remember. I touched each one slowly, whispering the words aloud, and the whisper grew into sentences, into stories, until I found myself speaking whole memories back into existence. The sound of my own voice filling the room despite the baby monitor's green light. Let them hear, I thought. Let them hear me remembering who I was, because they could not erase memory, not completely, and that realization became a kind of shield. From that morning on, I began to act differently, not enough to be obvious, not enough to alarm them, but enough to reclaim corners of my identity. I stopped drinking their tea entirely, and instead, I poured myself plain water, clear and honest, raising the glass to my lips with a slowness that felt ceremonial. I began to walk each afternoon, telling them I needed air, and though they frowned and muttered warnings about my knees, I went anyway, 1 block, then 2, then further. Each step reminding me that my body still carried me where I chose, not only where they directed. The streets became allies, with cracks and weeds that spoke of resilience, with trees that had grown despite pruning. And as I walked, I began to imagine myself somewhere else, a place where I was not managed but free. One day, while walking past the library, I saw a poster in the window advertising a community legal aid clinic. And though I did not enter then, the image stayed with me like a secret talisman, reminding me that outside their carefully curated home, there were still people who believed in rights, in voices, in signatures that mattered. That evening, I wrote down the phone number on a scrap of receipt paper and tucked it into my shoe, the ink pressing against my skin as I walked, a private reminder that escape was not only possible but beginning to form. The shift was also internal, in the way I began to observe them not as my captors but as fragile people clinging to control. I noticed how Greg's voice sharpened when bills arrived, how his shoulders slumped when he thought no one was watching, how my daughter's laughter was brittle at dinner parties, too loud, too rehearsed, betraying the fear that their life was only as perfect as their ability to hide its cracks. For the first time, I felt pity, not for myself, but for them, because they had built their existence on the illusion of power, and illusions collapse when tested. That pity was freeing, because it meant their cruelty was not a truth about me, but a weakness in them. In small ways, I reclaimed rituals that reminded me of myself. I began writing again, not only words, but full sentences, sometimes letters to no one, folded and hidden under the lining of my pillow. I wrote about the sound of rain on the roof when I was a girl, about the way my husband used to hum as he shaved in the morning, about the smell of chalk dust in my classroom. And as I wrote, I realized that they had not stolen my life. They had only tried to shrink it. But my memories stretched wider than their house, wider than their disdain. Each letter was a brick in the foundation of a new strength. The baby monitor remained, its green eye glowing each night, but I stopped fearing it. I began speaking aloud again, telling stories to myself in the dark, sometimes reciting poems I had memorized long ago, sometimes whispering affirmations that I would not be erased. Perhaps they listened, perhaps they mocked, but it no longer mattered, because the words were for me, not for them. In reclaiming my voice, even in the privacy of my own room, I felt the stirrings of agency, and I knew the next step would not be only survival, but action. The midpoint of my journey was not marked by a grand escape or confrontation, but by this internal shift, this rediscovery that I was still present, still capable, still in possession of a mind that could plan and a heart that could endure. They had tried to reduce me to silence, to dependency, but in the quiet of their dismissal, I found a deeper well of resilience. And so I waited, not passively, but with intention, gathering the threads of my strength, knowing that soon I would weave them into something larger, something they could not control. The past does not stay buried when you try to walk away from it. It follows like a shadow that stretches longer as the sun goes down. And just when I thought I had begun to reclaim small pieces of myself, the pressure around me deepened, not in sudden violence, but in the return of old forces and the arrival of new ones, testing whether the quiet strength I had been nurturing could withstand open confrontation. The second escalation began with something deceptively tender. A letter slid under my door one afternoon while I napped in the stale air of that cramped room. And when I bent to pick it up, my knees ached, but my heart moved faster than my body, because the handwriting on the envelope was not Greg's clipped block letters or my daughter's hurried scrawl, but rounder, hesitant, almost childlike in its loops. And as soon as I saw it, I knew it was from my grandson. I sat down slowly on the bed, the envelope trembling in my hands, and I traced the letters of my name written in his uneven style before I dared to open it. Inside was a short note, only a few lines, but every word carried weight. "Grandma, I don't know why you don't answer. Dad says you're tired a lot. I miss you. I hope you're okay. Please write back." There was no accusation, no performance, just a boy's plain truth. And the sight of his words made my chest tighten. Because here was proof that I still existed in someone's eyes. That I was not only a burden or an inconvenience, but someone worth missing. I tucked the letter into my nightstand, beneath the scraps of affirmations I had written to myself. And for a few days, it warmed me like a hidden ember, something to touch when the house grew cold with silence. But then the ember became a spark of danger, because my daughter found me holding the letter one evening, and her face shifted quickly from surprise to irritation to something harder, something fearful, as though she realized her control had been breached. "You shouldn't fill his head with things," she said, though I had not written back, though I had only been holding it. She reached for the paper, but I closed my fist around it and shook my head. "He has a right to write me," I said softly, my voice even, and for the first time in months, she looked at me as if she had glimpsed the old mother who once corrected her homework and set boundaries she had to respect. She stepped back, muttering that I was tired, that I didn't understand how complicated things were, and left the room. But I knew then that she would not forgive this small rebellion, that the letter was not only a child's affection, but a threat, too. The fragile order she and Greg had built. The retaliation came quietly at first. My outings were restricted, my walks monitored more closely. When I said I wanted to go to the library, Greg insisted on driving me and waiting outside like a jailer, his eyes tracking me as though I might slip into the stacks and vanish. My daughter began checking my drawers, tidying, she called it, but I knew she was searching for other letters for evidence that someone outside their house still saw me. Even the post began to disappear. Envelopes I expected never reached my room, and once I overheard my daughter telling Greg she would handle the mail from now on. They wanted to cut every thread that connected me to the world beyond their walls, to leave me suspended only in their control. But they underestimated the resilience of someone who has already survived loss greater than their petty cruelty. The pressure deepened when Greg confronted me directly. One evening, after dinner, when my daughter had gone upstairs, he lingered in the kitchen while I rinsed my plate, and he leaned against the counter with that casual stance men adopt when they want to mask aggression with ease. "You know," he said, "we've been doing everything for you, keeping a roof over your head, food on your plate, medicine in your system. Most people your age are in homes by now. Do you know how lucky you are?" His words were smooth, but his eyes were sharp, daring me to protest, and I felt the chill of the unspoken threat. That my place here was conditional, that my presence could be revoked at any moment, that I was meant to bow in gratitude for being tolerated. I dried the plate slowly, deliberately, and placed it in the cupboard before answering. "Lucky," I said, meeting his gaze, "is not the word I would use." He stiffened, his smile faltering, and though he said nothing else that night, I knew I had unsettled him, and that unsettlement would not go unanswered. Soon after, the pamphlets returned, not hidden this time, but placed openly on my nightstand. Glossy brochures of assisted living facilities with pictures of cheerful staff and wide hallways. My daughter presented them to me with a falsely bright smile, saying, "We just want you to have options, Mom. We're thinking about your comfort." Comfort. The word tasted bitter. What they meant was control, relocation, removal. They wanted me out of their carefully curated life, wanted me placed somewhere where my voice would be muffled under the institutional hum of scheduled meals and fluorescent lights. I nodded as she spoke, pretending to consider the pamphlets, but inside I felt the tightening of resolve, because I knew the time for waiting was drawing to a close. The second escalation was not only about their pressure, it was also about the way the past reasserted itself, demanding that I decide what I would carry forward and what I would finally release. One afternoon, while tidying the little box of mementos I had managed to keep, I found an old photograph of my late husband, Derek, holding our daughter when she was just a baby, his smile wide, her tiny hand grasping his shirt. The sight of it nearly broke me, because it reminded me of the faith I once had, the belief that love could sustain us, that the child we raised would carry forward our sacrifices with gratitude. But it also reminded me that I had already endured the worst loss once before, that I had buried a man I loved and still managed to keep living. And if I could survive that, I could survive walking away from the house that had become a prison. The confrontation came one night when I least expected it. I was in my room writing quietly under the dim light of the bedside lamp when the door burst open without a knock and Greg stepped in, holding one of my hidden scraps of paper, the ones where I had written reminders of myself. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice low but laced with anger. I reached for it, but he pulled it back. "You think you're some kind of martyr? Writing little notes about how strong you are? You're nothing without us. You'd be rotting alone if we hadn't taken you in." My daughter appeared behind him, wringing her hands, whispering for him to calm down. But she did not stop him. She did not defend me. I sat very still, my hands folded in my lap, and I said quietly, "I am not nothing. And you will not convince me otherwise. My voice did not shake, and that steadiness seemed to enrage him further. But he dropped the scrap onto the floor and stormed out, muttering about ungrateful old women. My daughter lingered a moment, her face pale, and she whispered, "Why do you make things so hard, Mom? Why can't you just let us take care of you?" And then she too was gone, leaving me in the dim light with the scrap of paper at my feet, its words still visible. Survivor. It was after that night that I made the call. I had memorized the number from the library poster, repeating it to myself during walks, and now, with my daughter out shopping and Greg at work, I used the house phone, dialing slowly, my hand trembling, but my voice steady, when a woman answered. I told her my name. I told her where I lived. I told her what had been happening. And when I finished, there was silence on the other end, before she said, "Miss Navarro, this is incredible. I remember you. You were my teacher." Her voice broke slightly, and suddenly I was no longer only a trapped old woman. I was someone remembered, someone who had once shaped lives. "Say no more," she said firmly. "We'll help." When I hung up the phone, my heart was racing, not with fear, but with the exhilaration of knowing that the walls around me were not impenetrable, that help was already moving toward me, that my silent endurance was about to become action. The days that followed were tense, filled with small confrontations and suspicious glances, as if they sensed something shifting, though they could not name it. My daughter watched me with narrowed eyes. Greg snapped more easily at the smallest mistakes, and the house itself seemed to hum with the anticipation of change. The pressure was immense, the past pressing against me in the form of letters, photographs, memories, while the present closed in with pamphlets, surveillance, and threats. And yet, through it all, I felt an unfamiliar clarity. I was not only enduring anymore, I was preparing. The second escalation was the storm before the break, the moment when the air grows heavy and electric, when every leaf trembles before the thunder cracks. They thought they had me cornered, weakened, silenced, but in truth they had sharpened me with every act of cruelty, every whispered dismissal, every attempt to erase me. They had given me the gift of certainty, the knowledge that there was no going back, no reconciliation, no safety in compliance. The only path forward was out, and I was ready to take it. The night of my birthday was supposed to be their stage, a carefully arranged performance of family harmony for the neighbors and their social circle, a display meant to broadcast how dutiful they were in caring for me, the frail mother tucked safely. Under their roof, the aging woman surrounded by love and laughter, and I could see the effort in every detail, from the polished silverware to the store-bought cake with "Happy Birthday, Mom," written in bright icing that tasted of chemicals and pretense. My daughter had dressed me in a blouse I had not chosen, pressing it against my shoulders with brisk hands, and Greg fussed over the wine glasses, lining them neatly, his smile fixed in place. But beneath the smiles I saw their unease, because they knew that in recent weeks I had been different, quieter, but not broken, watchful in a way that unsettled them. I carried my secret with me like a hidden jewel, the knowledge that I had spoken to someone beyond these walls, that my voice had already traveled further than they could control, and that tonight would not end the way they imagined. The guests arrived in a wave of perfume and chatter, neighbors who knew only the surface of things, who congratulated my daughter on her generosity, who shook Greg's hand as though he were a model son-in-law, and I sat at the table with a polite smile, nodding when spoken to, allowing them to bask in the glow of their performance. But inside, my heart was steady, my mind clear, because I knew that tonight was not only a birthday, it was a reckoning. As the evening wore on, Greg raised his glass, tapping it with a spoon, and began to speak about family, about sacrifice, about the importance of caring for those who once cared for us, and the hypocrisy of it made bile rise in my throat. His words dripped with sanctimony, painting himself and my daughter as saints who had opened their home to a burden, and I saw the neighbors nodding, charmed by his smooth tone, unaware of the surveillance, the pamphlets, the water bottle. My daughter smiled tightly beside him, her hand resting on his arm, her eyes flickering toward me as if to remind me of my role, the silent prop who should beam with gratitude. But I did not beam. I rose. Slowly, deliberately, pushing back the chair with a scrape that drew every gaze to me. I picked up the two glasses nearest to me, Greg's and my daughter's, and I held them high, the liquid inside trembling with the faint shake of my hand, though my voice when it came was firm, unbroken. "To parasites," I said, the words slicing the air sharper than any knife. "Who paid off this house in full before becoming your pet?" A silence fell over the table, thick and stunned. The kind of silence that follows blasphemy in a church, and in that silence I felt decades of dismissal shatter like glass. My daughter's face drained of color, Greg's smile collapsed into a grimace, and the neighbors shifted uncomfortably, sensing the rupture but not yet understanding its depth. And then, like an answer to my toast, the doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the tense air, and my daughter moved to rise. But I lifted my hand, still holding the glasses, and said, "No, they are here for me." Greg's eyes narrowed, suspicion flashing. But before he could speak, the door opened, and there she was. The woman I had once taught, now a lawyer, standing tall in the doorway with a folder of papers in her hand and resolve in her eyes. She stepped inside, her presence cutting through the room like a blade of light, and she greeted me not as a burden, but as someone respected, saying, "Miss Navarro, happy birthday. I think it's time we cleared a few things." She laid the papers on the table, the legal documents that revoked the power of attorney my daughter and Greg had maneuvered into place, the demands for restitution of funds they had siphoned from my accounts under the guise of household expenses, the formal notice that my departure from this house was effective immediately, backed by the authority of law. The neighbors leaned closer, whispering among themselves, eyes darting between Greg's tightening jaw and my daughter's trembling hands. The performance they had so carefully arranged unraveled in an instant, exposed for the farce it was, and there was no salvaging it. Greg tried to protest, his voice rising, sputtering about lies and manipulation, but the lawyer silenced him with the calm precision of someone who knew the truth and could prove it. My daughter, tears welling in her eyes, reached for me, whispering, "Mom, please, we can fix this. You don't understand. I never meant." But I did not let her finish. For the first time in my life, I did not soften, did not soothe, did not step into the role of forgiving mother. I met her gaze steadily and said, "I understand better than you think." Her hand fell back, her tears useless now, and in that moment I saw her clearly, not as my child, but as a woman who had chosen her comfort over my dignity. And I knew there was no return from that choice, I placed the 2 glasses back on the table with deliberate care, as if laying down a burden I had carried too long, and then I turned toward the lawyer, who offered me her arm. I took it, my spine straighter than it had been in years, and together we walked out of that house, past the stunned faces, past the neighbors' whispers, past my daughter's silent plea and Greg's clenched fists. I did not look back. The air outside was cool and clean. The night sky stretched wide above me, and with each step away from their door I felt lighter, as if the chains that had bound me in silence had dissolved into dust. That was the climax, the irreversible act, the moment when their story about me collapsed and my story reasserted itself. They could no longer contain me, no longer rewrite me, no longer treat me as something less than human, because I had taken the power they thought belonged to them and reclaimed it as my own. I had raised the glasses, I had spoken the truth, and I had walked away, and there was no undoing it. Now I live alone, in a flat that is not grand, not polished, not filled with the ornaments of a wealthy life, but it is mine. And that makes it more beautiful than any gilded cage could ever be. The walls are plain, the furniture second-hand, the linoleum floor worn thin in places where others have walked before me. But when I unlock the door at the end of the day and step inside, I feel a peace that I had forgotten could exist. The peace of knowing that every object belongs to me, every sound is mine alone, and every silence is honest. Not the silence of fear or erasure, but the silence of dignity. I wake in the mornings to sunlight that streams unfiltered through the window, laying soft patterns across my bed, and I rise slowly. Not because anyone rushes me, but because I choose the rhythm of my own day, and I make tea in a real glass cup, not a plastic mug, watching the steam curl upward as though it carries the last remnants of shame out of my body. I think sometimes of that night. The birthday performance turned into a reckoning, and I wonder whether my daughter and Greg replay it in their minds, whether they curse me for disrupting the story they had built, or whether, in the quiet of their own evenings, they feel the weight of what they did. But those thoughts do not hold me for long, because I have learned that freedom is not about winning their remorse. It is about releasing myself from the need for it. I do not need their apologies, their explanations, or their excuses, because I have already claimed what they tried to take, and I carry it forward in every small ritual of independence. The choice of what to eat, the key in my pocket, the decision to walk outside when I wish without asking anyone's permission. These are modest things to those who have never lost them, but to me they are proof that I am whole again. Sometimes, when I sit by the window with my tea, I lift the glass slowly to catch the sunlight, tilting it just enough so that the light refracts into tiny rainbows. And I think of the night when I raised the glasses in defiance, turning their toast into my weapon. That gesture has stayed with me, not only as a memory of defiance, but as a reminder that even in the smallest of objects, even in something as fragile as glass, there is power when it is lifted by a steady hand. I drink and I smile, not at them, not at the past, but at myself, because I know now that no one can unmake me as long as I remember to hold that glass high. There are moments of loneliness, yes, moments when I wish that my daughter had chosen differently, when I wish I could hear my grandson's laughter echoing in my home, when I wish family did not have to fracture under the weight of betrayal. But I remind myself that loneliness is not the same as abandonment, that solitude can be a space for healing, and that love does not always flow from blood. I have neighbors who smile at me without pity, strangers who greet me as an equal, and even the clerk at the corner shop who remembers my name gives me more dignity than those who once shared my table. The world, once narrowed to the suffocating walls of their home, has widened again, and in that widening, I have rediscovered myself. To the women who might hear my story, women who have been silenced, diminished, treated as burdens by those they raised or those they trusted, I say this: do not wait for their kindness to return, for it may never come. Do not waste your remaining days begging for the respect that should have been given freely. Instead, remember who you were before their voices drowned yours out. Remember the girl you once were, the woman who worked, the mother who carried more than anyone knew, the human being who deserves to be seen. Hide scraps of yourself if you must. Whisper your own name in the dark if you must, but never let them convince you that you are nothing. When the moment comes, and it will come, take whatever glass is before you, plastic or crystal, chipped or whole, and raise it, not in gratitude to them, but in honor of yourself. Because survival is not only in enduring, it is in reclaiming the right. To stand, to speak, to walk away. I sit here now, my glass catching the morning sun, and I know that I am free. Not young again, not unscarred, but free. And freedom, once regained, is a sweeter drink than any wine poured at their table.